It's a bad idea to invade Russia. So Bad Decision Dinosaur thinks this is great. This is not great. This is why. Russia is really, really huge and it's far away. To get from France to Russia requires, in 1812, that soldiers and armies march. They don't fly, they don't take a train, they don't take a bus, they march. By the time Napoleon and his armies get to Russia, it's September. It took them most of the summer to get across Europe. So now they're in Russia and it's summer, beautiful time of year, and they cross over the border into Russia. They are ready to fight the Russian army. So the French army progresses, and the Russian army doesn't meet them. The Russian army actually runs away. Now, partly this is because the Russian army was much smaller. The French have a massive army. So every time the Russian army moves away, the French army goes further. Russian army moves away. The French army goes further. This is part of a tactic called scorched earth. As the Russian army is pulling deeper into Russia, they say to the villagers, to the peasants of Russia, "Hi, sorry to disturb you, but you need to evacuate your village. We, the Russian army, we're going to destroy it, and we're going to destroy your crops." Now, very sad for the Russian peasants who had their livelihood destroyed, but the reason is the Russian army needs to make sure that Napoleon and his troops will not be able to benefit from the land. At this time, you would take supplies with you, but the army would rely on living off the land, living off crops and the supplies that they found along the way. So the Russian army is quite literally scorching the earth. They are burning the land to make sure there is nothing for Napoleon and his armies to benefit from. Finally, in about October, about 100 miles outside of Moscow, the Russian army finally stops, and Napoleon is ready to meet them on the field of battle. This is the Battle of Borodino. And because the Russian army is much smaller, they actually do retreat. So Napoleon sees this finally as a victory. He can beat the Russians, and he has a clear way to get into Moscow. So this will be symbolic. He'll march into Moscow, he'll be victorious, and he will once again restore his reputation. The problem is, so this is exactly what the Tsar wanted. This is exactly what the Russians wanted. By the time Napoleon gets to Moscow, it's about late November, which means it's pretty much winter. And his army is stuck because Moscow has been evacuated. The Tsar already had everyone leave Moscow, and most of the city has been burned down. There is nothing left for Napoleon or his armies. At this point, it's very cold. The soldiers only have the summer coats that they left with a couple months ago. They are running out of food. There's nothing to loot or for them to use in the city. So Napoleon has to make the choice. Do I keep my army in Moscow and let them starve? Or do I start on the journey home and they starve along the way? And he decides to go home. Eventually, by the time he reaches France, about, early in 1813, he only has 10,000 soldiers left. Of over 420,000 soldiers, only 10,000 survive. That is a huge loss. Massive, absolutely massive. But it doesn't really matter to Napoleon because what he cares about is his reputation and his pride. So check out the video on Canvas. It explains sort of how that battle goes. To restore his pride, okay, I can't let Russia win. So Napoleon is able to gather another army, and by this point, other countries in Europe have joined with Russia against France. So they meet in Germany at the Battle of Leipzig, also known as the Battle of the Nations. It is Napoleon versus Europe. He has lost so many soldiers that he does, in fact, lose this battle. He's forced to retreat. Once again, a blow to his pride. He runs away back to Paris, and just a few months later, these European armies, just very casually, without the need to do this quickly, they march into Paris, led by the Russian troops. They march into Paris, and they force Napoleon to surrender. So he now must give up his power, give up his empire, and this is March 1814. So everything that Napoleon did to try and build up his power, build up his ego, has failed. Absolutely failed. And that's why I love this picture. It is sort of the image of the sad, loner, losery guy. Every plan he had fails because it's all based on his pride, not on what was best for the people or best for Europe. So the allies of Europe, all of Europe decides, okay, we need to get rid of Napoleon. He shouldn't be in power anymore. Let's exile him. They sent him to the island of Elba, which is just off the coast of Italy. You can see on the smaller map there. It's in between Corsica and Italy. Remember, Napoleon wasn't going back to Corsica anymore. He was seen as a bit of a criminal. But Elba's quite lovely. Today you could drive across in about 35, 40 minutes. It's not a bad way to live. But he is mocked by many people as he was the emperor of Europe. Now he is the emperor of this little island. So few people. But actually, he's like, well, if I'm going to be here, I might as well make the best of it. He improves the government of Elba. He streamlines. He does some of the same things he did for the citizens of France. He has to make himself useful somehow. He has a nice house to live in. He has money to spend. He has troops to protect him. For me personally, I think this sounds like a good deal, but you got to remember what his level of expectation was. He wants greatness. He wants an empire. So Elba is just not enough. Even though he lives in this beautiful house, it still isn't enough. So he has to come up with what should he do next. Meanwhile, back in France, they need a government. So they decide to go to Louis XVI's younger brother, who will now be Louis XVIII. And you say, well, what happened to 17? That was the little boy who was in the Temple prison who died alone. Louis XVIII grew up in Versailles, grew up with the estate system, younger brother of our King Louis XVI. He now is an adult. He had sort of run away, didn't know if he would ever get to be royal again, and now he has a chance to be royal. This is a great opportunity for him. But it's not the same type of royalty he grew up with. It is a constitutional monarchy. The people of France they weren't going to give up all of their rights. They weren't going to give up all of the powers that they had earned or taken in the revolution. But they do fear that Louis XVIII will try to roll back and get rid of all of those changes to the government. He grew up in the estate system. He was used to total absolute power. So they were afraid that he would go back to this, and the people don't really like him. So then Napoleon is able to escape Elba. He disguises himself, gets on a ship that's disguised to be English, and lands at the port of Marseille. And from the time he lands in Marseille, it'll be 100 days until the next big event. The king sends troops to go arrest him. And all of the troops, because they love Napoleon still, after everything, the people love Napoleon. They welcome him back. And Napoleon eventually reaches Paris. In that time, newly crowned Louis XVIII gets the heck out of here. He goes, wait a minute, this guy's back? He's probably going to want to kill me because I took his power and all of that. So the people, the citizens, welcome back Napoleon because of all of the good that he did for them. People are willing to overlook things that are inconvenient or unpleasant in general, as long as they personally will benefit from it. Amazingly, Napoleon is able to compile a new army. 200,000 soldiers are willing to sign up to fight for him. And Napoleon now, he has to restore that pride. He has to prove to Europe that he is superior. So he's going to head towards modern-day Belgium to fight the British and Prussian troops who are still sort of hanging out in England after the Battle of Leipzig and the Battle of Nations. Check out this video on Waterloo. The major battle that happens in Belgium is known as the Battle of Waterloo. With the British and Prussian armies, they were all clumped together. Napoleon's grand plan is to conquer and divide. If he can separate them, if he can wedge the French army between them, he can concentrate on one at a time. Remember, Napoleon went to military school. He was a brilliant tactician. He knew all the maneuvers, but he also had a huge ego. And that ego, once again, gets in the way. On the morning of the battle, it had rained sort of that morning and that evening. The field was muddy. And in Napoleon's plan, he needed the artillery. He needed to wheel the cannons to specific locations. And it was too muddy for him to do that. So he decided to wait to let the sun come up a little bit higher, dry out some of the land. And in that time, while he is waiting to have this perfect plan as he sees it in his mind, the British and Prussian troops are able to surround him. So once again, Napoleon is defeated on a huge scale. This is why, when someone makes a mistake or someone has a personal, crisis and they make a mistake. It's called their Waterloo, because this was such a huge mistake on Napoleon's part. Once again, the British do get a hero out of it. Our first one was Lord Admiral Horatio Nelson, and now we have the Duke of Wellington. He was the commander of the British troops. And where Trafalgar Square is commemorating Lord Admiral Nelson, the Duke of Wellington gets rain boots named after him. If you are ever in Great Britain, it's raining, you might need a pair of wellies, or you're out in the mud, wear a pair of wellies, named after Wellington because the muddy battlefields. And there's also beef Wellington, which is quite delicious. So Trafalgar Square and Nelson, and delicious dinner and footwear for Trafalgar Square for Admiral Lord Nelson, and footwear and a delicious dinner named after Duke of Wellington. Seems like a pretty even place for me. Both are excellent options. So again, the countries of Europe have to decide, well, what do we do with Napoleon? We could send him back to Elba, but he escaped. So instead, they find an island out in the middle of the ocean off the western tip of Africa called St. Helena. 2,000 miles from anything. It is really in the middle of nowhere. It takes forever to get there. It is constantly circled by 2 British naval ships. Yes, that is expensive. It's a hassle. It's an investment. But to the European countries, it is worth it to make sure that Napoleon can never, ever escape and can never wreak that kind of damage on Europe again. He dies 6 years later in 1821. So even with all of the negative, the horrible things that Napoleon did, this is his grave. This doesn't look like the grave of a villain. He still was a hero to the French citizens. As many soldiers that died, there are thousands, millions more who benefited from Napoleon's rule. It's really the rest of Europe that was negatively impacted.